This session will be on religion and social entrepreneurship. We're going to be talking about research opportunities at the intersection of these two literature streams. So really excited about that. Today we're privileged to have the opportunity to hear from four fantastic scholars. We'll be hearing from Dr. Stephan on the light and dark sides of religion and social entrepreneurship. Dr. Tucker on the topic of religious calling in social entrepreneurship, Dr. Lumpkin on the influence of religion on civic wealth creation, and Dr. Newbert on religion as a contextual factor in entrepreneurship research. The way the session will work is each panelist will have the opportunity to speak for 10 minutes on the particular topic, and then there will be a time for question and answer at the end. You're more than welcome to post questions in the chat. But we will have a specific time at the end where everyone will get a chance to ask questions. So it should be an exciting hour. I'm going to go ahead and we'll get started with Dr. Stephan. I'm going to ask this question. In what ways might religious motivations for social entrepreneurship lead to a positive and adverse consequences for the well-being of the social entrepreneur? Are there any areas for future research in this realm you believe might be interesting to consider? So without further ado, Dr. Stephan, if you want to.
Thank you very much, Sean. Can you hear me?
Absolutely.
Great. So hello, everyone. And two caveats before I start. I think I fall into the category that of scholars who Brett introduced as, I know you haven't done anything on religion before, but would you be interested to join the conversation? And so with that caveat, I'm gonna look at religion really from the very individual level perspective. You may know I do a lot of research on well-being. And so in that line of research, religion and spirituality are often, kind of considered together and not necessarily differentiated. And so that's kind of the background. And also, I'm going to talk a little bit about well-being, basically, if you can tap further, Sean, because Sean gave me these great questions to talk about. So thanks again for all the preparation you did on that. And so why well-being? Because, well-being matters to us individually, to entrepreneurs, unsurprisingly as well. And broadly, anything well-being describes the quality of an individual's experience and functioning. It happens to be one of the Sustainable Development Goals, good health and well-being, and we know increasingly that it's an important outcome of entrepreneurial activity. And here's my second caveat, because some of it, clearly you heard an esteemed clinical psychologist Ken talk about in his keynote about religion and well-being. So hopefully I can add something very forward-looking. I didn't really find any evidence, and I'm going to forward look about the individual. I'm going to say something about the organization, and then also touch briefly on a societal level. So if I could have the next slide, please. And please do feel free to disagree, or, I'm really looking for a conversation here. So the question was, how do religious spiritual motivations to pursue social entrepreneurship might impact the individual social entrepreneur? And so, as Ken also mentioned, there is a lot of evidence that suggests really that individual religiosity and spirituality are a source of well-being, both actually of mental health and also of physical health, including these statistics that probably if you believe, so to speak, or spiritual, you have a higher chance to get older. And the pathways, how this happens are quite interesting, and I think they intersect really with what we're starting to look at in the well-being space or stress, research on stress and entrepreneurship. And so broadly, there are three mechanisms of how individuals' religiosity, spirituality can enhance resilience ultimately through enabling coping with stress. So there's also an intersection here with the research on mindfulness, which ultimately comes out of religious practice. There's interesting links with positive emotions like gratitude and awe, so that distinctive positive emotions that are tied to religiosity and spirituality. And there is a whole lot of evidence that religiosity helps coping with anxiety and threat. And all of those we don't know, specifically in the context of social entrepreneurship, but it seems to me that all of this should help make social entrepreneurs happy, if you want. There's obviously the bigger issue, and that starts to intersect with the notion of eudaimonic well-being, that you derive meaning and purpose, have answers to existential questions, also all tied to religiosity, spirituality. I think, and there's another dedicated panel on this, there's intersections with identity. So if you have multiple identities, not just the identity of an entrepreneur, that also helps you to cope with stress if things don't go well in the business, which we know is a major stressor for entrepreneurs because they start then to question their identity as entrepreneurs. If you can draw on other identities, then that's a coping mechanism. And of course, all the social connections and social networks. So overall, meaning, purpose, dealing with stress seems that if you, would certainly be a benefit to being a social entrepreneur if you can draw on your individual religiosity and spirituality. If we go to the next slide, and we've already talked about possible double binds, it may also be that if you pursue social entrepreneurship with those motivations, it may actually enhance what we call the well-being trade-offs of entrepreneurial work. So yes, it may enhance your well-being, as I just made a case for it, but it may also enhance your ill-being because your whole experience becomes more intense because the purpose is much more closely aligned ultimately with a bigger identity that you have, not just the entrepreneurial one. It may also stimulate something called over-resilience. And so that kind of speaks to the dark side of resilience a bit, or also kind of almost a self-exploitation mechanism, whereas you're pushing yourself through adversity in the name of purpose and, because you and aligned with the bigger identity, you may actually overdo it. So we know that over a short run of time, resilience is a good thing, but may you actually start to sacrifice your own health and through stress processes by persisting through adversity for a long time. And then of course there's always also a link to be made, and I should say that there's very few studies that really look at the well-being of social entrepreneurs, and they both find the bright and the dark side. But certainly there seems to be a potential link through exhaustion and burnout. And we know that these things happen when you engage in personally very meaningful work. And so it could be that you have this paradox that actually, because you're motivated to make a real difference to people, you actually perceive the social impact as that you make, and maybe you may actually make an important social impact, but you may not perceive that as very impactful because you know that the social issue is just so big and because your desire to help is so much greater. So there might be a challenging link there with the negative side, downside. If you could click further, Sean. So in a sense, then I think social entrepreneurship inspired by religious and spiritual motivations might be an exemplar context to theorize and research both the positive but also the potential adverse effects of eudaimonic well-being for entrepreneurial activity because of this intrinsic link to purpose and meaning. And if we can go to the next slide, thank you. So just want to briefly shine a light also on the organizational level. So we often talk about entrepreneurs, but obviously entrepreneurs hopefully create businesses who also employ others. And you might say on the plus side, there might be an intrinsic link that actually all of this may make for better workplaces, right? So if you have religious or spiritually motivated social entrepreneurs, they may create better, more meaningful, more supportive and respectful workplaces, where also you get more trust and generally more positive relationships from beneficiaries or with beneficiaries and stakeholders, because we know that one of the things that religion does as a signaling device, so to speak, is that it elicits more trust. However, it may at the same time also diminish employees and also volunteers' well-being. So there are some initial findings that by appealing to a higher purpose and transcendental rewards, so essentially your reward comes in the afterlife rather than in the here and now, we see some examples, cases of social enterprises that use these rewards to justify current poor working condition and currently low pay. So there might be something that's for a dark side worthwhile to look into. And that may also be bound by the setting. So it could be that these phenomena are particularly pronounced in contexts with weak rule of law. Let me give you one example. So Tunetser, with the reference there is actually a PhD thesis which looked at African microfinance organizations. So in Ghana, in a context that doesn't necessarily have a very strong rule of law. And that's exactly what we saw there was that the microfinance institutions that actually were, in terms of social impact, perhaps the best ones or the most successful ones, they were actually using religion internally, almost as an HR tool to say, okay, you know, your rewards come later, you need to work very hard here, and what you do makes a difference. Okay, I see I should wrap up. If I could have the next tab, Sean. So maybe then on an organizational level, it's useful to think through this as how social entrepreneurship the well-being of their stakeholders and overall to build also a more socialized perspective on entrepreneurship and well-being. And the next slide, because I'm out of time, I'm going to try and summarize, and if you can just tap for the research opportunities. So if we look at religiosity, not of the entrepreneur, but as the societal context within which the entrepreneur operates, I think that's really an area where there are a lot of untapped research opportunities, because a lot of research has looked more at kind of religious denominations and groupings, but actually could argue that the ultimate traditional socially supportive institution in terms of context is really whether, you know, people are nice to each other, supportive, collaborative, and all of that might happen particularly in societies where there are high levels of religiosity. But on the other hand, it may also be too much of a good thing, because that may only encourage certain types of social entrepreneurship, perhaps not the one that really tries to change the system ultimately and bring about societal change, but more that's kind of, in a sense, replicative and mimics existing or complements existing community-based organizations. And there's also something to be said to look at the interplay really of, you know, which social entrepreneurs in terms of individual religiosity thrive in what sort of context. But I leave it there. Thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Stephan. A little round of applause from everyone. Thank you so much. Appreciate that. We'll have time for questions at the end. So please feel, I see a question here, please feel free to post. We'll get to them at the end. So next, we have the privilege to hear from Dr. Tucker. And the question that, that he'll be addressing today is, in what way is social entrepreneurship a religious calling? How can understanding religious extend our understanding of why people start and persist in social entrepreneurship? So understanding religion, extend our understanding of that. Without further ado, I'd like to hand it over to Dr. Tucker.
Hi, guys. So I think in trying to address this question, I just wanted to start with calling. And I looked at some of the calling literature and saw that they believe that it's one of the most controversial issues within the calling literature. How do you even define it and conceptualize it? So it's a very difficult thing to conceptualize, but we'll try to work our way through that as we answer some of those questions. So there's no consensus on how the term is defined, and current approaches are diverse, but can be organized using a general distinction between neoclassical and modern definitions. I'm talking very fast because I have like 50 slides.
You did a lot of work for this.
I tried to, yeah. So the neoclassical view builds on the classical view and essentially traces it back to the Protestant Reformation, Luther, Calvin. It says that you're destined for a particular type of work based on innate gifts and abilities that ultimately glorify God or a higher power. And of course, those two men were Christians, so they were looking at it from a Christian perspective. And you know, moving it more towards the neoclassical view, scholars have recently sort of, I would say, taken the higher power out of the equation and said, is it more about simply pointing to destiny, duty, and discovery? And that's kind of how you get this definition of a neoclassical view. Is it based on innate gifts and abilities or a particular type of work, with destiny, duty, and discovery at the core of it. And if you go to the next slide, the modern view emphasizes more of an individualistic view where you're looking at self-expression, self-fulfillment, internal passions, interests that bring about enjoyment. And is it really meaningful to the individual and not simply or only does it benefit society, right? You're kind of looking at it, does this bring you some type of meaning and purpose? Does it really benefit you? And is that how you view calling? So next slide. One definition from Justin Berg, Adam Grant, and another colleague, calling is broadly an occupation that an individual feels drawn to pursue, expects to be intrinsically enjoyable and meaningful, and sees as a central part of his or her identity. Well, next slide. This is not really helpful in terms of looking at calling in a religious perspective. Next slide. But Ryan Duffy, who's at Florida, I think the current editor of Journal of Vocational Behavior, said calling is more about three components: a caller, meaning and purpose, and pro-social motivation. So if we looked at this in terms of a caller, right? If an individual feels called to a specific type of work, this implies a caller. And we might say a caller being a higher power. Who is calling you, right? Who is calling you in whatever sort of context? Next slide. Of course, something that allows meaningful or a life domain that allows expression of a sense of purpose. Next slide. And does it help others, right? Is it a help toward greater good directly or indirectly? So if we use this perspective, we might be able to kind of link religion to the sense of calling in 2023. So this perspective allows us to examine calling as a religious principle in a social entrepreneurship context, maybe more fully. When, where, and how a social entrepreneur is called by a higher power to venture on behalf of others. So just trying to link those multiple literatures together. I would say in almost every religion, there's a call to others. And I'm referencing my own work when I say that. But a call to do what, right? A call to do what if there's a call to do something, a call to do what? Next slide. I would say that also these calls within different religions or practices of spirituality can be interpreted individually and received and felt individually, but sometimes also collectively. Next slide. So I'm now trying to offer maybe different approaches to how we might look at the intersection of religious calling and social entrepreneurship. Not necessarily research questions yet, but just even various approaches. So here we might think of different approaches and suggest the starting points. In most religions, particularly the ones that we have talked about today, there is a sacred text. So within the sacred text that we're talking about of these religions, is there a call to others? And I believe there is, right? If we look at those texts and look at scholarship, is there a call to others? And is there a call to venture for others? So there's a sacred text. We can also look at as a starting point, the actions, motivation of some social entrepreneurs. Was it a religious call for them? Actions or receptions, as an example of the beneficiary community, was this a religious calling that they received? Hey, you guys were called to help us. How might we interpret that in the context of social entrepreneurship? And sometimes we could even look at the geographic choice of some social entrepreneurs and social ventures. Also different types of organizing when we talk about calling, religious calling, and social entrepreneurship. And not last, but just one other thing I would highlight is when we look at certain religious leaders, particularly pastors and preachers, what are they saying when they speak about calling or being called in the context of sermons and those types of things. So next slide. I say, let us apply this to the Christian religion or faith in the social entrepreneurship context. So again, I sort of would say, let's look at the scriptures in the Holy Bible from Genesis to Revelations that speak to calling, and specifically a call to business practice, as we call it, social entrepreneurship, or are adherents inferring something from scriptures when they read the Bible. And how far do we go in terms of biblical literacy when we examine this? Next slide. All right, so we can see that there's, and I could put a lot more scriptures here. Is there a calling to care about humanity? right? And I would say there are plenty of scriptures that say we should care about humanity, whether it's Leviticus 25:35, 1 John 3:17. We should care about animals, right? Humane treatment. You can look at Proverbs 12:10, the environment. You can look at, the earth, Genesis 2:15, Psalm 115:16. And it looks like there's just fundamentally, if we only were to look at scriptural text, there's a call to care about God's creation, right? If we were to interpret that way. And I reference my own paper again, sort of looking backwards and not forwards. I reference my own paper, which is one of the worst titled papers probably in history, A Xenophilic Perspective of Social Entrepreneurship. What I just was trying to get at here is that there's a hospitality call, right? There's a call to be hospitable to all of God's creation. Next slide. So at a different conference in the past, I kind of asked, well, this call to be hospitable, what does that really look like? What does that really look like for social entrepreneurs? And I'd asked, what motivates social entrepreneurs to empathize with foreign others or venture for them? So next slide. We can see throughout scripture, the Holy Bible, we can see throughout scripture that hospitality is a central tenet of Christianity. It's a central tenet of Christianity, as opposed to xenophobia. How does that translate into social entrepreneurship? So next slide. There's faith-based roots of hospitality or xenophilia in scripture. Next slide. This is just a definition of it. You can go to the next slide. I know I'm really short on time. Next slide. So the call to care for others through commercial activity, I believe I see in scripture, right? And that would be xenophilia in the Holy Bible, but also diapha in the Muslim context. And I don't want to butcher the word in the in Hebrew, in the Judaic context, but hashanat or shim, right? Would that also be hospitality toward others and venturing for others in social entrepreneurship? Go ahead to the next slide. So, but we'll go back to the next slide really quick. Yeah, all right, so that's actually my wife. My wife was a refugee and she came here 23 years ago. And the woman she's hugging is her aunt who's still a refugee in Uganda today. She has not been able to come to the States yet. But if you go to the next slide, this is not about just sort of missionary work. Go to the next slide, Sean.
All right, there you go.
And the practical implications of this is some social entrepreneurs in the city that I currently live in, Baton Rouge, have taken it upon themselves to say, you know what? We don't want to be missionaries. We want to be hospitable to others. We're going to start a coffee shop that only employs refugees. It will only employ refugees. And we're going to show hospitality that way because we feel called to foreign others. So if you go to the next slide, I would say that this is what I've seen in practice mostly, and a little bit of scholarship. But I think we should also look at how religious leaders and their vocabulary are influencing a call to social entrepreneurship, a religious call. So next slide. What you will find if you listen to at least mega church pastors and people predominantly on YouTube speaking is the question has shifted from a religious calling and social entrepreneurship to who has called you and who are you assigned to? The language has become more about assignments within calling. Are you assigned to someone? What's your assignment as a social entrepreneur? What's your assignment in this business practice? Is it the community in Rwanda? Is it the community in Congo or different parts of the world? And I think the language is going there. Or perhaps the better question might be as we segue to Dr. Lumpkin's Dr. Lumpkin's part is there a civic religion with a civic call for civic wealth creation? So I tried to do maybe too much in that time, but I think there's a lot here, maybe too much in 10 minutes, but I think we're just at very nascent stages. So I'll give it back to you, Sean.
You did great. Thanks, Dr. Tucker. Let's give a round of applause. Zoom round of applause. Thank you so much. Appreciate that. We'll dive into questions. If you have any questions on that, please feel free to post in the chat. Without further ado, we're going to move to Dr. Lumpkin with a question on civic wealth creation. Specifically, how does religion influence the capacity of stakeholders with different logics to join forces in collective actions that improve the welfare of segments of society? Under what conditions are shared desired outcomes for the welfare of society across religious perspectives enough to facilitate partnerships that can create civil wealth? So we're looking at the influence of religion on civic wealth creation, something that Dr. Lumpkin is an expert on. So, Dr. Lumpkin?
Thank you, Sean. You can actually go to the next slide. Yeah, good. So first, happy to be here, and I appreciate especially the opportunity to work on civic wealth creation, because that's most of the focus of my work right now. I will say this, that when Sean and I discussed the question, when he posed it in sort of a longer version of it, he put forward this first bullet idea here, which was the idea of communities with homogeneous religious beliefs. How might they differ from those with heterogeneous religious beliefs? And he sort of contrasted the Christian South in the US with what might be considered an exemplar of religious diversity, namely Queens, New York, considered to be one of the most religiously diverse kind of communities. So how at the community level might those different kinds of the beliefs that are held by a community influence how they went about creating civic wealth creation. And so that's part of what I looked at here. Let me just say a couple of things also. I tried to focus on kind of research opportunities here. What kind of questions might actually result in a study. And so I'm going to look at these two different contingencies. One, target beneficiaries, that is, who are they trying to help? And secondly, what are their religious motivations for helping? And I've got to say, I was so intrigued by the conversation earlier today leading up to this point, because the way I framed religious motivation is as religious reasons versus spiritual reasons. So I'm not sure what zeitgeist or unified field we all tapped into getting ready for today's session, but this idea of religious versus spiritual was part of the thinking that that I developed as well. So with that, let's go to the next one, Sean. So if those who are targeted for help are religious members or would-be religious members, the effect on civic wealth creation might vary. And so the tiny homes for AA homeless is a sort of not an example so much as a thought experiment. You know, I'm envisioning a organization, a community in the religious South, let's say, that has purposed to help the homeless by creating a tiny home community for those who have recently joined AA, become sober, and sort of declared their faith. Now, you know, AA is very clear that you don't have to be religious in order to be a member of AA. You just have to have a commitment to becoming sober. But as a matter of fact, a lot of these different AA organizations are run by churches, or they're run as Bible studies. And there's a tremendous amount of references to God and the Bible in the literature surrounding Alcoholics Anonymous. And so it seems to me that in a situation where, you know, those who are sort of initiating these change, and again, I'm thinking of a community, that those who might be initiating such a change in a community like that would probably be dealing with other people who shared their beliefs. So maybe the tiny home contractor or the landowner or the local inspector that needed to approve the project. All of those people might likely be a part of this community with more or less homogeneous religious beliefs. And likewise, if they're creating this tiny homes for people who have recently declared their faith, would be religious members, then I would think that there would be a higher likelihood that you know, they would take a sort of ownership of this. And so I'm thinking of something akin to psychological ownership. I call it, on the next slide, religious ownership. But I also think that religious ownership in a similar project in Queens, New York, where it was a highly heterogeneous religious community, might not be okay with the idea that a project that was for maybe not a tiny homes, but a tiny apartments, a project for those who have recently gotten sober, homeless who have become sober and joined AA, they might have a negative reaction to the idea that the nature of the AA meetings were going to be primarily along the lines of Christianity, church meeting, Bible study kind of orientation to the AA. So my argument is that to the extent that there's this sort of psychological ownership or religious ownership around the notions that are being fostered for the members of the organization, that this might affect whether or not they're going to create civic wealth. I've already been warned that I'm running out of time, so let's go to the next slide here. Here again, this notion of religious motivation, and go ahead to the final slide. Again, my argument here is that we can say that's unfortunate that religious and spiritual have been dichotomized, but if you think about religious reasons as sort of wanting to share the benefits and the features of the faith, wanting to sort of share the values of the faith and the tenets of the faith, versus spiritual reasons that sort of more universal ideas that were found, for example, in the slide that of Brett Smith's quote, values that are held across religion, such as helping those in need, generous sharing, promoting peace, expressing gratitude. I am drawing a difference here between those. And I'm saying that if the religious reasons are to promote the faith, then that's not going to work for so well in a context where a heterogeneous religious community is trying to create civic wealth, hence the negative arrow in the model. So I think that just to sum up, I could say more about all of this, but to sum up and try to stay on time here, I think that the question of whether or not there are religious reasons versus spiritual reasons that are linked to religion is something that you could find data about, that you could research, and you could probably identify different groups. I say this from my own background, where I have been involved both in sort of more highly Christian proselytizing groups, and I've been involved in more neutral, humankind loving meditation groups. And I think that those groups are out there and would lend themselves to a comparative analysis about how they might function under different circumstances. So I'll stop there in the interest of time and take questions later.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lumpkin. Appreciate you. Let's give a round of applause. Zoom, thank you so much. Yeah, we'll have questions at the end. Really appreciate you putting together the models and all this. This is wonderful. All right, so our last panelist is Dr. Newbert, and he will be discussing religion as a contextual factor in entrepreneurship research. So the question that's posed to him is, can you talk about the role of religion as a contextual factor in entrepreneurship research? For example, how might a religious lens shape the questions we ask in our research? What insights might we gain about how religion influences entrepreneurial phenomena? And what factors might scholars consider when measuring this construct in an empirical work? So without further ado, Dr. Newbert.
Thanks, Sean. I appreciate it. I will, since I'm the last person, I figured I'd have limited time. So I have one slide, no references, so everybody can sort of see where I'm headed throughout this talk. I am going to ask Sean to just drop 2 articles in the chat. A bit of shameless promotion,
Yes,
but the first actually deals directly with context in entrepreneurship research broadly, and the second is an article that uses religion as a contextual variable in an empirical piece that my co-authors and I had just published. So those might be useful or not as you're interested. But I want to address each of the questions that Sean posed. So I'll sort of take these in order. If we think about how religion can help shape the questions we ask, I think there are 3 main ways in which it can do that. The first is with the distinctiveness of the space. So in particular, what unique influences does religion sort of inject into the entrepreneurship process? And it could be things about the individual, about their motivation, their goals, their intention. It could be about the relational aspects of entrepreneurship, so like the partnerships they create, the resources or the resource exchange relationships that they engage in. And there could be strategic issues too, right? Like the type of opportunities they choose to pursue. And this gets at some of the previous comments, particularly Reg's comments about calling, how they measure performance, the time horizons, et cetera. I think ultimately what is important about this particular issue of distinctiveness is that I think if folks in this room want to have the rest of the field take them seriously and the work seriously on issues related to religion, I think we need to sort of carve out this as an independent area of research. And I think there's been a lot of overlap in recent years with sort of religious entrepreneurship, social entrepreneurship, in particular in sustainable and maybe development entrepreneurship as well. There is certainly some overlap in those spaces. But there's this implicit assumption that religious entrepreneurship is social entrepreneurship, and Ute and Reg and Tom had touched on this a bit as well. But we know that not all religious motives are good ones, and we know that not all religious callings end up the way we sort of would think a social entrepreneurship would, entrepreneur would. And if we take people like Jim Jones or David Koresh, and I'm sure my Waco folks in here know that name well, they had callings, but didn't really end up in ways that we would sort of love. So I think that we need to think about what makes religiously motivated entrepreneurship distinctive from other similar areas, and really try to drive that into the questions we ask. In terms of the role that religion might play, I think we also want to look beyond just sort of IV or DV places in our conceptual models for religion. Think about what sort of mediating or moderating or contingent effects religion might have. I think that's where the interesting part of this research space can go. How we think about religion in terms of what steps might matter more or less in the process. We've heard I think earlier today, 4 out of 5 people on the planet claim a religious affiliation, but not all people, sort of understand the way in which that can affect some of the work that we do. So, what are some of the differences between sort of religious and non-religious groups? And this gets into sort of the subgroup issue, right? So how does entrepreneurship play out differently for religiously and non-religiously affiliated individuals? And also, how does that differ based on the intensity of one's beliefs, right? Or the denominations that they affiliate with, or the frequency they engage with religion. So there are some ways in which we could explore different subgroups within this space to really find out some of the ways in which religion might unfold differently depending on the sample we're looking at. So if I move on to sort of the insights that we might gain from some types of this research, I think there are some who, what, when, and where factors that are particularly interesting. First with regard to the who, if we think primarily about the individual there, and I suppose we can think about the firm as well, particularly in entrepreneurship context, what types of individuals or what types of firms pursue this type of entrepreneurship process differently, right? Like, what is it about that religious calling? To go back to Reg's talk, how does that reshape the way we think about opportunities in particular, right? We talk about opportunities being recognized, discovered, created. When you're called to a particular vocation, what does that mean, and where does that fall in the process? In terms of the what questions, what factors might lead to positive versus negative outcomes? Ute talked about this a bit when she talked about things like over-resilience, exhaustion, burnout, reduced well-being, and what sort of factors, if we think about a configurational approach, even might sort of what recipe of those factors might lead to some of those positive or negative outcomes. In terms of the issue of when, if we think about the importance of religion in people's lives has decreased over time. I think the numbers are still there, but I think the influence it has over people's lives on average is lower than it once was. And how has that changed calling? How has that changed their engagement with entrepreneurship? And then also, from a less longitudinal standpoint, but more from sort of a Schumpeterian shock standpoint, how do economic, environmental, social, political disruptions affect the presence or the efficacy of religious entrepreneurship? We've seen, in particular, Trent Williams has done a lot of work on environmental disasters and what happens afterwards, and a lot of religiously motivated entrepreneurs will sort of come in, set up shop, and try to restore the community. But I think there are other types of shocks that we might want to look at and that might be relevant. And then in terms of where, not just geographic regions like nations or states or ecosystems, but also different industries or groups, which ones and what configuration of characteristics are more or less palatable to this form of entrepreneurship, and what sorts of structures and institutions support those that are trying to engage in religiously motivated entrepreneurship. And then the last column here on measurement. And I think there are 4 issues that we want to think about, at least 4, I should say, when we're engaging in this. First, in terms of conceptualization, just broadly speaking, what is the essence of the construct we're actually trying to measure, right? How are we thinking about the issue of religion? Or to go back to Tom's talk about, is it religion? Is it spirituality? Reg, is it calling? What are we actually talking about when we talk about religion, and what sort of data do we really need to measure that appropriately? I know we're all, well, I should say, not lump you in with me, but I'm a very opportunistic data person. So when I have data, I try to sort of think about what study I can create around that, but that really limits you, right? So trying to marry the conceptual ideas that you have around religion and what that means in terms of data requirements is really important. The specificity of your measure, is this just a 0-1, religious or not, or is this more categorical, in terms of affiliations or denominations, or is this something more continuous where you can get into issues of religious diversity or religiosity, things that are a bit more fine-grained and presumably can get us a little bit closer to the truth. The third issue is dimensionality. Religion is not a unidimensional construct. There are many sort of moving parts in how we think about that, particularly if we want to really get some richness in our data. And that has implications for how we think about the measurement of this, right? Do we want to view this as sort of a formative construct, or is this more reflexive? Is it unidimensional or multidimensional? Do we want to aggregate or disaggregate our indicators into a meta dimension or multiple different dimensions? There are reasons to do any of those, to make any of those choices, but we need to think about, what's driving, the relationship between the indicators and the construct, what elements do we really want to measure, and what makes the most sense for our study in terms of really getting a robust representation of what our view of religion is in our studies. And then the last element here is inclusivity. What are we, when we talk about religion or spirituality, what are we including and what are we excluding? There are 5 sort of major religions, but I just checked on Wikipedia, and there are thousands of other major and minor schools and movements, and we make value judgments when we decide to include or exclude certain of those, right? I mean, not that we can include 4,000 dummy variables in our regression, but we may want to think carefully about what we are considering to be religious and how we group those. And this gets back to the issue of subgroups, right? When we're thinking about how we might parse out some of the different effects, we want to make sure that we have always and we're sort of recognizing some of the differences and similarities across those different religions. So I'm out of time, but hopefully this was helpful in stimulating some thought, and I look forward to continuing the conversation. Thanks.
Sean, I don't know if we can hear you.
Oh, sorry. Thank you.
There you go.
Appreciate you letting me know that.
Okay.
So round of applause for Dr. Newbert.
We got
Thank you
that.
so much for your time and for sharing that. So I've been informed that we have until 12:05, allowing us 15 minutes for question and answers. So I'm going to actually pull down, I'm going to go back to this view here, and I'm just going to open up the floor. We do have 2 questions that have been posed in the chat, but I'm going to open it up to everyone. I'll start with Amanda. She had a question earlier on. Would you mind asking your question, Amanda?
Yeah. So one of the things that I think comes up a lot in our research and as we're talking to people is kind of where's the crossover? I think it's really easy to start having conversations about these topics only with academics and doesn't really get outside of the walls of the university. And so I would be really interested to know more about the practical implications of our research in the ways, especially when we think about motivation and to Ute's point about the potential dark side, when you're really committed to something, you feel kind of if it's a religious motivation or whatever it is that kind of enhances that motivation, that can lead to things like burnout, that can lead to overexertion. I think we see that in practitioners as we go out and we do these, especially qualitative studies. So what are some of the ways you think we can translate what we're doing to influence practice or to at least speak to practice beyond solely academic research?
We'll open that up to any of the panelists that want to take that.
I might just jump in real quick here, Amanda. Thanks very much for your question. And I guess I can even speak more broadly than just this conversation. So JVB just published an article by Pablo Munoz and Dimo Diva about sort of what you're talking about, right? Their idea is, how do we engage with practitioners in a way that sort of co-creates research questions and research topics, right? And how do we sort of meld theory and practice, but they take a really different perspective on it than sort of, just requiring practitioners to tell us what to study, but it's a more collaborative exercise. And I can drop the citation in the chat. It literally is the most recent article published, and it's also in our special issue for calls to action for advancing the field of entrepreneurship. So, but I think this is really relevant to what you're asking because, again, if we're not having conversations with the constituencies that we want to help understand and help maybe prescribe some ways to do their task better, I think we're missing the mark. So I'll drop that in the chat, but I think it's a great question.
Wonderful, thank you.
Maybe I can comment on this as well, because part of the reason why I started more research, doing more research on well-being is because it seems to resonate with the entrepreneurs. And there is more and more stories coming out of burnout, both mainstream, if you want, commercial entrepreneurs, but also social entrepreneurs. And I think religiosity in particular, if we understand it right, could be a real resource. And so a while back with Amanda Williamson and Jeff Gish, we've actually written an editorial of how you could design, basically co-create small randomized control trials to kind of test out recovery interventions. So anything, given that there is a high level of stress emotionally, also through the connection with your venture. And as I said, if that's kind of then infused in your identity through religious motivation, that's probably even worse. So I think there's a real, and we try to provide some guidelines. It's very practically written for how you do research. It actually matters through the intervention itself. Hopefully you get a bit more, positive effects for the intervention group, but then hopefully really you can actually tell practitioners this is how you do it, because literally you've changed something that leads to how you do it. And I think just kind of what we didn't cover so much in that editorial, but thinking what made me think through reading through all this literature on religion, and also I think the positive emotions are often under-recognized. So there's a nice paper, and Barbara Fredrickson is one of the co-authors. It's just a small cross-sectional study, but it really emphasizes these positive emotions that are unique, they tied to spirituality and religiosity, like awe, gratitude. And actually in the occupational health domain, you have kind of day reviews, gratitude exercises. So I think there's a real synergy there to, for lack of a better word, leverage the religiosity, spirituality for enhancing well-being.
Thank you.
That's wonderful. All right. Any other panelists wanted to respond to that, or we can move on to another question? All right. Are there?
I was just, I don't know.
Oh yeah, go ahead.
I don't know if I have much to add. I think in thinking of a question, is it? I guess like translating to maybe to even practice. Is that what you were asking, Amanda?
Yeah.
I guess a different approach, and perhaps a lot of this is probably research for me. I've done some work on poverty and entrepreneurship, and at LSU we started a poverty boot camp where we help people in the community who are or nearby community who we perceive or think are in poverty, and entrepreneurship is one way out. So we have a 6-week boot camp we do at LSU, and I sometimes teach these courses in the 6-week boot camp.
Mhm.
And we collect the data from it as well, and we've now published a little bit from that. But I guess in that sense, sometimes we can see in the same way some of the things that we find we can take to accelerators, boot camps. And what I mean by that is I'm in the south of the South, right? I'm in South Louisiana. I'm not far from New Orleans, which is where I grew up. And there are so many churches that are promoting entrepreneurship from the pulpit, from the platform. I mean, it's salvation and entrepreneurship, salvation and entrepreneurship. So there are several churches that offer entrepreneurial classes for congregants, and I think that would be one way where we see it in practice. Now, translating what literature into practice is a different story, but I think that's where we could begin to see it, in my experience.
Very cool. Also, side note, congratulations on the women's basketball team at LSU. National champions. Way to go.
Very excited.
All right. Anyone else? Any questions? Oh, it looks like we have a question here. It'd be helpful to have thoughts on how can social entrepreneurship impact religion in a diverse space, specifically if in a minority calling group. Any comments on that? So how does social entrepreneurship impact religion?
Could I just clarify my question, because
Sure.
I feel like it was difficult to write it. So basically, I was intrigued by the comment from Brett Smith earlier on that question of how does entrepreneurship impact religion, and then I'm thinking of in terms of if you are based in a place where your religion that you want to kind of propagate, I would say, is in a minority area, and if you also struggle to engage with civic structures, perhaps they're hostile. So how would you engage in that sort of area, and also while maintaining the well-being part as well that was referred to earlier in the conversation as well?
Thank you, Jessica. Would any of the panelists like to respond to this?
I'll just jump in this way. It seems to me that the idea of a social enterprise or a social business being sort of a witness to the rest of the world, to the community, I think is a pretty I'm not so much sure that it would influence religion to your specific question, but it might influence the way to the way you clarified your question, the way that the religion is perceived by the community. And so, you know, I mean, just the example that Reg gave of the business that was, you know, dedicated to hiring refugees. And if there could be a social enterprise that had, you know, values around improving the well-being of a group or the improving the well-being of a community, that I think that they have the ability to influence perceptions of the religion in ways that, you know, proselytizing would not, or pamphlet publishing, or whatever you want to talk about would not. If there's if the business itself actually operates with these principles, is faithful to you know, to its mission, and yet, you know, is still a business doing business, you know, revenue in, expenses out, and, you know, having legitimacy that goes with being a business, then I think that serves as not just a model, but a witness, an example, a way to reflect the values that nothing else does. And in that respect, I think that it can influence perceptions by a community of a religious, a minority religion in the case that you had asked about.
That's great. Thank you, Dr. Lumpkin.
Maybe to add to that, if I have.
Yes, please do.
Yes, yes. I was trying to remember which paper it is, but there is this nice paper by Johanna Meyer and colleagues that illustrates how you're in, you know, context of poverty, how social entrepreneurs actually, or non-governmental organizations, use religion and use religious texts to actually reframe the role of women in particular in society where they were excluded. So actually also an example of how you, through social entrepreneurship and through going back to the text in the spirit of Reg, kind of and involving community leaders also as a source of legitimacy, how you really work from within religion to open it up and kind of, you know, challenge the norm that it's excluding certain parts of society. I can't remember which one of the papers it was, but I think there's something to be said for also, you know, not changing religion necessarily, but almost kind of people working from within it and through kind of community-based transformational processes. So very much kind of deep level social change processes.
Thank you, Dr. Stephan. Anyone else? We do have another question, which we could hop to. Dr. Conger, would you like to elaborate on your question?
I don't know that I need to elaborate. I just wonder, a lot of us in doing social entrepreneurship talk about hybridity and potential tensions or lack thereof and how they're dealt with or how they're not. I'm just wondering if the religion is, I think many people outside of this conversation might say, well, that just falls underneath one of those triple bottom line. That's just a social objective, right? If you have a religious motivation to help the poor, that's the same as your motivation to help the poor. I'm just wondering if there's, if it's more complicated than that, and if that's something we might want to start discussing.
It's more complicated than that.
I thought that too, Tom.
Yeah, you know, I mean, honestly, I can imagine spending an hour just talking about that. It's super messy. I mean, I think about what Reg just talked about of what's being done from the pulpit, entrepreneurship, being, promoted, alongside other values. And it seems to me that the part of what makes it messy is, the long history of, sort of religious there being religions that are like, your well-being and livelihood and success is, is what God wants for you, versus those that think, religion, the religion of, being willing to be poor and being willing to sacrifice and all that sort of thing is kind of anti, business. And so that's why it's awfully messy and hard to give a simple answer to.
I would just add to that. I think it's a really great question. And just kind of going back to my comments from earlier, I think scholars in this space assume that what they're doing is entrepreneurship. I think that's a mistake. There's no boundary that is being created for work in religion. To sort of piggyback on Tom's comments, there's a lot of different values and a lot of different reasons that people get into this type of entrepreneurship. And if we just assume that they're all social and all good values, that's not necessarily the case. They don't have to be bad. They could just be agnostic to whether or not there's a good or bad outcome. But there are specific things, the types of ingredients you might use in your cooking, right, is a religiously motivated decision that is neither good nor bad, right, from a valuating standpoint. But it does have implications, to Michael's comment, on the economic well-being of the enterprise. So I think it's important to carve out the space differently than the space for social entrepreneurship to make sure that there's a home for this type of work.